Speculative fiction has the ability to take us to far-flung worlds and hobbit homes, but of the two main speculative fiction genres, sci-fi and fantasy, I find it's sci-fi that I turn to for thought-provoking reads. Both genres have their standouts, but for me it's science fiction that I often find myself thinking about for years to come. Fantasy is enjoyable, it's pure escapism, and I love to read it, but it doesn't change me, it doesn't give me something to think about. There's a huge range of science fiction, from the literary to the awful, from the absurd to the real. My hope that these 9 recommendations will give you something to read whether you love the genre or not. I think some of them you'll probably have heard of before, but some of them you might not. I'm interested in reading more science fiction, and if I've missed out on what you think is really thought provoking and deep fantasy, I'd like to hear about that as well. So let me know what your favourite speculative fiction books are down in the comments. What would a world look like if we took mass consumerism and disposable items to its logical extreme, where the world was completely controlled to generate a so called utopia? The state has taken over every aspect of your life, indoctrinating you and medicating you to make sure that you feel only happy and good emotions. The whole of the human experience reduced to a hedonistic and Pavlovian pleasure fest. This is The Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. This Brave New World contains a criticism of many different types of political and economic philosophy, and it's not a commentary on any particular one being wrong, as much as the idea that humans will bring about a utopia through economic and commercial means. In particular, Huxley was responding to a sort of buoyant optimism of his time, where people really thought that the perfect future was just around the corner. And in a world where we've increasingly measured all sense of success by growth and our use of a finite set of resources, and we've become addicted and dopamine driven in ways that we just haven't before, Huxley's message still seems timely decades later. Now, I hesitate to recommend Dune because, one, it's probably one of the most famous science fiction books ever written, and two, since its massive blockbuster success in Hollywood, everybody's talking about it. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it's one of the most impressive and most important pieces of science fiction literature there is. I don't want to sound like a hipster, but I read Dune long before they made the movie. The grand scale and scope of the project is bewildering. This is a Game of Thrones for the science fiction world. And if you don't love science fiction, this read has plenty to offer you, but it is a very big read. And though, of course, it contains speculative technology, the science fiction elements really aren't the most important part of the story. This is a commentary on themes of religion, ecology, morality. I think it's beyond any doubt that given enough time, this work will move out of the genre reading category and just into classic literature. It really is one of the greatest modern literary accomplishments, at least in my opinion. No matter what you think of current artificial intelligence tools, you have to understand that it is both a surprising and fascinating technology. It isn't at all obvious that you could turn text into chunks of numbers, feed those chunks of numbers into a giant equation, get other chunks of numbers back, turn it back into text, and that would be useful. It's probably one of the most surprising results in history. And so it's with these recent developments in mind, I'm going to recommend that you read Permutation City by Greg Egan. This is a book that resists easy summary, but instead of ruining it for you, I'll just give you the broad theme. In general, it's an exploration of some of the more technological philosophies of mind. It's commenting on virtual reality, artificial intelligences, solipsism. In particular, in this constructed world, there's a prediction that the most important sort of fungible economic resource will be computing power in the cloud. And with the way that things are going with the sort of GPU gold rush and this huge push to build fusion powered nuclear reactor data centers, I think that might be more true than we think. And one of the most impressive things about science fiction is when it gets really close to the truth. And this book was written, 30 years ago now. Now, in my mind, there are sort of two titanic space opera series in the science fiction genre. You've got the Culture series and The Expanse. Now, I love The Expanse and I've read most of it, but what I want to recommend is the first book of the Culture series by Ian Banks, Consider Phlebas. I think that the ideas in the Culture series are more nuanced and complex than in The Expanse. And while both are fun to read, in the context of this list where we're thinking about science fiction that's thought provoking, I think the Culture does a better job in that regard. consider Phlebas is a compelling, exciting, and unique story about a changeling assassin. It's a real masterful demonstration of the writing by show don't tell, and I found myself hoovering through the pages looking for more information about this universe that had been constructed. And that's one of the best recommendations I can give to a science fiction novel, one that convinces you such of its world that you're desperate to be a part of it. I've read The Forever War by Joe Holdman more times than I can count. The best way I can sum it up is a sort of reactionary novel to Starship Troopers. It's a commentary really on the Vietnam War and the horror of war through a sort of techno futuristic lens. And Haldeman, he does a perfect job of representing both the brutality of war and also the banality of military life. I grew up in a military family on a military estate, and it really echoes some of the ways around when our fathers went to war. Because of the nature of the book, Holdman is able to move through many different futuristic scenarios, from some from the close to the very distant future, and his speculation throughout is both thought-provoking and also realistic. And though, of course, as time moves on, the ideas become increasingly far-fetched, I think they all say something about the human condition. Let me just give you the elevator pitch for The Children of Time. A accelerated genetic experiment has gone wrong, and instead of accelerating the development of some primates, instead it has infected the ants and spiders of a sort of jungle-based world. This leads to those spiders and ants and other creatures forming complex societies. And from that premise, this book expands and extrapolates and explores this idea to its full extent. And in truth, there is a sort of storyline occurring outside of just exploring this development with some humans off-world and comparing and contrasting sort of this building society against this devolving society. And I didn't really care for that part of the work. The exploration of the evolution of these spiders is so exciting and interesting that I still recommend it. One of my favourite parts of the book is this sort of technological arms race between ants and spiders who are at warfare with one another. The Quantum Thief has a real special place in my heart. The Quantum Thief was the first truly hard science fiction book I ever read. I was gifted it during what I now think are the defunct Reddit book exchanges, which is really sad because it was actually a really amazing program where people around the world would send each other books. The experience of reading The Quantum Thief for the first time is a sort of literary experience that I haven't had until I started reading The Infinite Jest recently. This is show don't tell taken to its most logical extreme. You will have no idea what's going on in this book. Nothing is explained. You're thrown right into the deep end of a complex and detailed world. Now, for some people, that might be just way too much to handle. However, if you're willing to put a couple of hundred pages of effort in and just let what is masterful prose, technobabble, but beautiful technobabble, wash over you, you'll come to a point where you actually start to understand that it's not technobabble, and this author has constructed a really complex and cohesive universe. It's chock full of really interesting ideas from philosophy and physics and mathematics. And I also just love gentleman thief and heist stories. And if you like those sort of stories, you'll love this regardless of if you love science fiction. Kurt Vonnegut hopefully needs no introduction. And The Sirens of Titan is one of my favourite books of all time, let alone one of my favourite science fiction books. And if you've read other things by Vonnegut and you haven't read this yet, this was his second novel, and it was really where he found his very unique voice and tone. It's a darkly humorous and ironic tale where people are mercilessly stripped of their free will. And it's that stripping of free will which is a constant theme through all of Vonnegut's work. Again, this is another book where it would be a crime to summarize it for you or go into too many details of the plot. So just go and read it. It's not that long. And if you haven't read any Vonnegut, you're really doing yourself a disservice. Go and read Slaughterhouse-Five or Breakfast of Champions. These are really fundamental books. I think I just love Vonnegut, so like, take it with a pinch of salt. Thanks to a truly awful movie adaptation and a author who isn't quite as good at putting his political views forward as his science fiction, Ender's Game is a infamous and famous novel. But most people don't go on to read the second book, and that's The Speaker of the Dead by Orson Scott Card. This book takes place thousands of years after the twist ending of Ender's Game, which, don't worry, I'm not going to spoil. It's totally unlike Ender's Game. It's a much deeper and more complex work. Some of my opinion about this book is because of when I read it. I read it as a teenager, And at a point in my teenage years where I hadn't yet considered some of the ideas in this book about death and grief and forgiveness, and ultimately it's an almost philosophical and theology sort of based text. And having just read Ender's Game, which seemed almost childish in comparison, the huge expanse in scope and scale of the ideas really took me by surprise. And sometimes we love a book because of the time that we read it. If we read it at the right time, it leaves a huge impact on us. If we read it at the wrong time, maybe we struggle with it. And that's a good reason to put books down, because later in life might be the right time to read a book. Or it might just be that that book was for an earlier time in your life and it doesn't suit you now. I don't think that you need to read Ender's Game to enjoy this book. In fact, all of the ideas from the first book that you need in the second book are well explained. And I've heard, but I haven't looked into how true this is, that Ender's Game was just written to set up the writing of the second book. Regardless, I do think it's a really fantastic book and it left a deep and lasting impression on me. Well, I hope my 9 recommendations have given you some ideas of something to read and an exploration of the scope of the science fiction genre. As I've said many times, there's nothing that you shouldn't read. And while there are better things to read and worse things to read, we should read widely. And also remember that sometimes we can read things just because they're fun. If you enjoyed this video and you like science fiction, let me know down in the comments. And if you like books and learning and self-study and all of these sorts of topics, look in the description box below to Substack, where you can read more of my writing, and I'd really appreciate you checking that out. And I'll link to all of the books that I've mentioned down below. Thank you very much for listening. My name is Harry Smith, and this is Pages to Practice.